As someone who celebrates the sacrament of reconciliation often, it is not uncommon for me to hear a penitent confess that they have committed a mortal sin. Rarely a day goes by without me hearing this. What is in fact uncommon to hear is someone who has actually committed a mortal sin. While the Christian faithful are most certainly capable of committing grave acts against God and neighbor, and they do happen all of the time, there seems to be a great misunderstanding among the faithful as to what actually constitutes a mortal sin. How does the Church define this type of sin, and what conditions are required for it to count? This is Catholicism in Focus. While some Christian denominations will contest this point, it seems almost too obvious to say that not all sins have the same gravity or culpability attached to them. Stealing a candy bar at 5 years old and murdering your cousin at 35 are very, very different sins. For this reason, the Catholic Church has held for centuries that sins can be grouped into one of two categories: venial sins, offenses that are of a common variety and do not require special remedies, and mortal sins, acts that are so grave they cut one off from the grace of God. The Catechism describes a mortal sin as an act that destroys charity in the heart of man by a grave violation of God's law. It turns man away from God, who is his ultimate end and his beatitude, by preferring an inferior good to him. When we talk about mortal sins, we're not talking about stealing a candy bar. For the most part, we're not even talking about stealing in general. Mortal sins are so grave that they leave you outside of the communion of faith, unfit to receive the Eucharist, and cut off from charity. Yeah, so the stakes are pretty high here, and we want to be careful how we use this term. So how do we determine what is a mortal sin and what is just a venial sin? The Church teaches that 3 criteria need to be met in order for it to be a mortal sin. The first has to do with the nature of the act itself, namely whether or not it deals with grave matter. In order for it to be a mortal sin, it has to be serious. Now admittedly, and probably in its great wisdom, the Church doesn't offer a clear definition or comprehensive list of what is considered grave. The Catechism points to the foundation of moral law when it teaches grave matter is specified by the 10 Commandments, corresponding to the answer of Jesus to the rich young man. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and your mother. Obviously, this is just a starting point and not to be confused with a full list. There are certainly plenty of grave acts that are not enumerated in the commandments or explicitly mentioned by Jesus, and there are surely instances in which violating one of the commandments is far from a grave act. Again, murder? Yes. Stealing a candy bar? Not so much. What's important here is to remember the overall definition we're working with. A mortal sin is something so egregious to Christian life that it cuts one off from the grace of God. Being that there is no exact or comprehensive list of grave sins taught by the Church, there will always be debate on what it includes, but the concept itself serves as a good starting point. Is this act so serious that it would cause a fundamental change in my relationship with God and others? If it doesn't, then it cannot be a mortal sin. With the exception of one instance, which we'll get to next, if there is no grave matter, there can be no mortal sin. But if it does deal with grave matter, in other words, causes a fundamental change to one's relationship with God and others, then we must look to the second criteria, the full knowledge of the sinful character of the act. As I discussed in a previous video, there is more to consider in moral theology than the act itself. Running someone over with your car is by no means a good thing, but there's a major difference between unsuccessfully swerving to avoid them and successfully swerving to hit them. One's intention when acting is equally, if not more, important to any determination. The same principle applies here when determining if something is a mortal sin. In order for an act to qualify, the one committing it must be fully aware of the nature of the act, what they're about to do, and what the consequences of it are. There is no such thing as accidentally committing a mortal sin. In the case of unintentional ignorance, cases in which a person was not only unaware of their actions, but was free from any responsibility for knowing such things, the Church teaches that one's culpability for a sin is diminished, if not completely removed. This might include accidental situations, cases where the person acted out of passion without fully considering the consequences of their actions, or even those times when they were impaired in some way, say by drugs or alcohol. Now, of course, this doesn't give you the right to get drunk and do whatever you want or to always act on impulse. There are still sins of negligence and recklessness, and the Church reminds the faithful that no one can be ignorant of certain foundational principles of love and life. Saying, "Oh, I didn't know you couldn't murder," isn't gonna fly. Certain things are written on our hearts and will always be wrong. That said, if you are not fully aware of what you are doing or don't realize that you are committing a grave offense, then it cannot be a mortal sin. If there is no full knowledge, there is no mortal sin. But if there is full knowledge in grave matter, or the exception from above, if someone believes something to be a mortal sin, even if the act itself is not grave, and chooses to act precisely because they think it is, an act of true defiance, then we must look to our final criteria: complete consent of one's unhindered free will. One of the great mysteries of our human existence is the fact that God gave our nature the capacity to both love and hate, to obey and to disobey. Even within the purity of our unadulterated nature before the fall, we had this capacity. At the same time, we know that our will is never completely free. Sometimes it is the weight of concupiscence that clouds our judgment, but other times we can be affected by forces beyond our control and choosing: addictions, vices, pathological disorders, trauma, even coercion. For this reason, the Church teaches to form an equitable judgment about the subject's moral responsibility and to guide pastoral action, one must take into account the affective immaturity, force of acquired habit, conditions of anxiety or other psychological or social factors that lessen, if not even reduce to a minimum, moral culpability. In other words, if someone has an addiction, a deeply rooted vice, or factors outside of their control, making decisions to do good immensely difficult or nearly impossible, there's the possibility that they are free from guilt. This consideration is of particular importance to the Church in regards to sins like pornography and masturbation, as it's often the case that these sins are the result of compulsion rather than disobedience to the law, but really, it can be applied to any sin. Addictions are very real and often have a stranglehold on people's free will. If you are not completely free to choose what is right, for whatever reason, if you are unable to give complete consent to an action, it cannot be a mortal sin. If there's no consent, there's no mortal sin. But if there is complete consent, if you are unhindered and in your right mind, choosing with full knowledge of the gravity of a sin, then we have a problem. Because what you've done is knowingly chosen to do something in an act of defiance against God and neighbor. In these cases, you have said with full knowledge of what you are doing that you no longer want to follow God's law. You could, but you just don't want to. When someone finds themselves in a state of defiance such as this, the prohibition against receiving the Eucharist and other sacraments is not so much a punishment as it is a protection. It's not to inflict further harm on someone, but to recognize that they themselves have injured their relationship in such a way that they are no longer in communion with God, that something has to be done lest they hurt themselves further. A husband who cheats on his wife, or a woman who murders her brother, wouldn't just go and sit down at the dinner table with the rest of the family as if nothing had happened. The gash in the relationship would prevent them from receiving any benefit at all, and they'd likely cause further pain to their family. Reconciliation needs to happen before the relationship can move forward. Luckily for those in this situation, there is recourse to the sacrament of penance. With the exception of a few extremely rare situations, any mortal sin can and should be forgiven by a priest, as this is the normative function of the sacrament, to forgive mortal sins. But how prevalent are these sins? It's an interesting question. I can certainly say from experience that penitents come to the confessional all the time, lacking one, two, sometimes all three conditions, and so a lot of what people think is a mortal sin actually isn't. But what about those who are fully formed? There are some in the Church who, recognizing the fallen nature of our world, suggest that it is quite easy to sin mortally, that we do it all the time. Others, recognizing the serious conditions required, suggest that it is extremely rare, even impossible, for someone to have an active intention of separating themselves from God. Me, all I know is that we are certainly capable of doing serious harm, but there is nothing so grave that can keep someone from God if they repent. It's good to take these things seriously and to examine our consciences, but at the end of the day, what does it matter what we call it? We should hate all sin and seek God every time we fall.